Welcome, everyone. This call is now being recorded. I'm Becky Strong, the Outreach Director for the IPPF, and I'll be your host for today's webinar. So thank you for joining us. I'd like you to thank you for being on the webinar and for the support provided by Sanofi and Regeneron for making today's call possible. Before we begin, we want to take a quick poll to see how many of you on the webinar have participated in a clinical trial. And while you're answering the poll, I'd like to introduce our speaker for today. Dr. Arsalan Shabir, MD, PhD, received his medical school training at the University of Buffalo School of Medicine and completed his dermatology residency at the University at Miami School of Medicine. He has been working in clinical development for over 10 years in the fields of stem cell biology and immunology. Now, I'd like to go over a few housekeeping items. You will remain in listen-only mode throughout this webinar. For those of you who are on your computer for this webinar, you'll see on your screen that you can access the audio either by using your telephone to call in or from the speakers on your computer. Please click the little caret or up arrow next to the audio settings in the bottom left-hand side of your screen. As you can see on my screen right now, you have the option to select your computer speakers or to dial in by telephone, so please be sure to select the method that you'll be using. If you'd like to ask a question, please click the Q&A button on the bottom of the screen and then type your question into the text box. We will try our best to answer as many questions as we can within the hour, so please feel free to type your questions into the text box throughout the presentation. Dr. Shabir will be answering questions at the end of this presentation. As a reminder, on the webinar today, we are discussing an overview of a study to evaluate the efficacy and safety of an investigational drug in adult patients with bullous pemphigoid. If you ask a question that does not pertain to the subject of the call, I'll have to ask you to email me your question after the webinar. And as a reminder too, for those of you who are not on the web, you will not be able to ask a question. So if you'd like to ask a question, please click the link that was provided for you in your confirmation email. Now it is my pleasure to hand things over to Dr. Shabir.
Thanks, Becky. Thank you for that amazing introduction. Hi, everybody. I'm Arsalan Shabir. I'm a study director of this Bullous Pemphigoid study that I will be introducing. Just to remind everybody, today's webinar is for US patients only. So if you live or receive medical care outside of the United States, we ask that you please log off for today's session. And the purpose of today's webinar is to discuss a clinical trial, and we invite you to submit your questions regarding the study to the moderator. We will try to answer as many questions as we can today. That said, we will not be answering questions regarding other indications for the study drug or existing data for this indication. We also cannot discuss or take questions about your particular medical circumstances. If you have questions about this study that are specific to your circumstances, please talk to your doctor. So I'm just going to share my screen. Becky, you probably just let me know, am I sharing?
Yes, we can see your screen.
Fantastic. Okay, all right. So thank you again to IPPF for this amazing opportunity. And I'm really excited to be here with everyone, and including with the patients on today. I'm excited to present our Bullous Pemphigoid study. So what are we going to cover today? I'm going to give you a little description about Regeneron, an overview of clinical trials, discuss with you what are monoclonal antibodies, and give you an overview of the Liberty BP clinical trial, and then we'll end it with question and answer. So a little bit about Regeneron. So Regeneron is a leading biotechnology company that invents life-transforming medicines for people with serious diseases. We've been around for nearly 35 years, and our goal has been to use the power of science to bring new medicines to patients over and over again. What is a clinical study? So a clinical study involves research using human volunteers. They're also called participants. That's intended to add to the medical knowledge. And the reason for doing clinical trials, it's to compare new medical approaches to standard ones currently available. And it's also to determine the efficacy and safety of the intervention and treatment. So you can see from this image, you can see the process that it undergoes for it to get to a clinical trial. It starts in the laboratory with discovery and preclinical. Then it's your phase 1, where we often assess, sometimes in healthy patients, sometimes in patients who have the disease. Then we move on to phase 2, and which are obviously bigger than phase 1 studies. These studies often are proof of concepts to see whether the drug would work. And then phase 3 are your big studies or confirmatory studies for which we use to get FDA approval. And today we're going to be discussing about our phase 3 study in Bullous Pemphigoid. So oftentimes clinical trials use placebo. What are placebo treatments? They're often used by researchers in clinical trials to improve understanding of how new medical treatments may work. They come either in the form of sugar pills or saline and water injections. And the effect of medications and placebos are studied and compared to one another to determine a medication's effectiveness. So you can imagine having a placebo arm is quite important to understand whether your drug will work or not. And how are placebo treatments used in a study? They're often used in double-blind study, like the one I'll describe today, where one group of participants are given placebo while another is given actual medication to be tested. Neither the patient nor the researcher knows who receives the placebo, avoids biases, which is important, and can often result in patients who receive placebo having the same positive effect as those who have taken the actual medication. What are monoclonal antibodies? Monoclonal antibody, our study, which I'm going to describe in a little bit, is the study of a monoclonal antibody. Monoclonal antibodies are proteins made in laboratories that act like proteins called antibodies in our bodies. They're often referred to as MOABs or MABs, and antibodies are part of the immune system. And normally they seek out to destroy foreign materials called antigens and attach to them and destroy them. But monoclonal antibodies can also be used to stimulate the body's immune system. And the term monoclonal means antibodies created in the lab, which are clones or exact copies of one antibody. So monoclonal means that all the antibodies are from that, they look the same. So I'm just going to give everyone an overview of our study. So our Liberty BP study is a study that's looking to study dupilumab in patients with Bullous Pemphigoid. We have a number of objectives in the study. The primary objective is to see whether dupilumab is superior to placebo in the ability of patients to discontinue and remain off of oral corticosteroids in patients with Bullous Pemphigoid. As you can see, all patients will be on oral corticosteroids, and some patients will get placebo, some patients will get dupilumab. The idea is to see how many patients can discontinue off of oral corticosteroids, which is currently a standard of care for the treatment of BP. We have additional objectives of the study. We're looking at how dupilumab affects itch. You may be aware that patients with BP, like yourselves, who have it, are extremely itchy. We're also looking at how dupilumab impacts health-related quality of life, which is how are you doing in other measures of your life, such as your activity of daily living, how is that being impacted in patients with BP, and how will the study be conducted? So patients are chosen at random to receive either dupilumab or placebo, and the intervention is given by subcutaneous injection once every 2 weeks in combination with oral corticosteroids. That's an important point. Everyone does get steroids in the treatment, just that one arm will get dupilumab, another arm will get placebo. And then we're going to be assessing, as I mentioned, the primary objective, how patients are able to get off of the steroids. And I think this is just an image, I think, of Bullous Pemphigoid. You may be aware, these patients with BP like yourself, some of you, develop these blisters, which can be quite painful. And then around these blisters, and sometimes within the blisters, there's a feeling of very soreness and itchiness all around these blisters. So obviously, when we do a clinical study, it's necessary to have certain inclusion criteria. And some of the clinical inclusion criteria of our study is we're looking at clinical features of BP, Bullous Pemphigoid, like that image I showed you, having blisters, being itchy. And then we're also looking at the diagnosis of Bullous Pemphigoid. So the way we diagnose Bullous Pemphigoid is through a couple of methods. One is through looking through a microscope. So we look at the skin to see whether it supports the features of Bullous Pemphigoid. We also do blood testing. There are certain markers of the blood, the serology that kind of tell us, is this Bullous Pemphigoid or not? And then we often also, for confirmation, use a special microscope that picks up antibodies to the skin. So that's what we call immunofluorescence. We're also, for the inclusion criteria, male or female, ages 18 to 90 at the screening visit. And if you're in Japan, it's 20 to 90. Willing and able to comply with clinical visits and study-related procedures. Willing and able to understand and complete study-related questionnaires, and willing and able to provide voluntary signed informed consent. Now, obviously, this doesn't include all the inclusion criteria. For those who are interested, your study doctor can kind of help you and go over with you all of the inclusion criteria. Now, obviously, if you have inclusion, we also need to have exclusion criteria. And these are criteria that may exclude or prevent you from participating in the study. Some of these criteria, if you have forms of pemphigoid other than classical BP, so here's some listed here. Obviously, we'd be able to kind of tell, the study doctor should be able to tell from your clinical features, but also those testing we do that I mentioned in the previous slide. And then if you're receiving certain treatments that are known to exacerbate or worsen Bullous Pemphigoid, some of them listed here. I mean, obviously, there are certain medications that are known to cause BP, and this will be kind of evaluated by your study doctor. And again, this doesn't include all the exclusion criteria. And as I mentioned, they'll be reviewed by your study doctor that may affect your eligibility to participate in the study. So I think that's it for my presentation.
And we just appreciate everybody who has joined us today, and especially you, Dr. Shabir, for sharing some great information and answering our community's questions on these trials. And also a great big thank you to Sanofi and Regeneron for sponsoring our patient education webinars. Before we go, I do have a few announcements. We hope that you will join us on Thursday, April 6th, when Dr. Annette Chernick, Medical Director of Derm Medical in Connecticut, to discuss the fundamentals of pemphigus and pemphigoids treatments of prednisone. We'll be hosting a webinar also on April 19th with Dr. Donna Colton, Associate Professor of Dermatology at the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill, to discuss rituximab treatment. Registration is now open, and you can register for these webinars today. We also want to thank you, all of you who have participated in the externally led patient-focused drug development meeting that we hosted back on January 25th. If you didn't get to speak or share your story, we are still looking for people to submit written comments. If you're interested, please submit your written comments to pfdd@pemphigus.org. Written comments should either cover your disease and how it impacted your daily life, or the treatments for your disease, the side effects of the treatments, and how to improve them. Written comments should be no longer than 500 words, and all written comments will be published in our Voice of the Patient report and shared with the FDA and industry partners, and will be used for future decision-making when developing drugs for our diseases. Do you wish there was a better understanding of our diseases by doctors and researchers? Do you wish there were more FDA-approved treatments and better treatments available? Well, here's your chance to get involved and make these goals a reality. Join the IPPF Natural History Study today. The Natural History Study is a patient registry sponsored by the National Organization for Rare Disorders, NORD, and the U.S. Food and Drug Administration, the FDA. Your information is private. The Natural History Study follows strict government guidelines to assure patient information is protected. Your participation in the data will be used by the IPPF to help advance research, better understand the patient journey, find better treatments, and hopefully one day a cure. By sharing your journey and answering some questions, you directly have an effect on the future of all people affected by pemphigus and pemphigoid. So get involved today. Visit www.pemphigus.iamrare.org and join today. If you're interested in helping to continue to support the IPPF and allow us to continue to provide free programs and services like today's webinar, you can become a Healing Hero. Healing Heroes fund the future of the IPPF community by making sustaining monthly gifts to support our mission of improving the quality of life of all of those affected by pemphigus and pemphigoid. No amount is too small, and your monthly donation goes a long way and continues to allow us to provide for the greater good of the community. The IPPF also has a number of virtual support groups across the country. If you're interested in attending a meeting, please check the IPPF's event page to register. Also, we're also looking to expand our support network. So if you're interested in starting a support group in your region, please contact me, Becky Strong, at Becky, B-E-C-K-Y, at pemphigus.org. It's easier than it sounds to start a support group, and you can help connect others in your area with other patients who understand this disease. A recording of this call will be sent out with a survey following today's webinar. So thank you for joining us. Goodbye.